Now that I'm more than 15 episodes into the rework retrospective, it's going to be one of my more enjoyable series to work on, even though it may not be the most popular. I think it's because I started playing League right at the beginning of this entire modernization period back in Season 5, so it's kind of nostalgic to see older versions of every champion, especially since I played a lot of them. One of the earlier reworks that came about was Taric, who got his VGU midway through 2016 in what I might consider the most successful failure of all time. There were ambitious overhauls before him, no mistake, but to me Taric's relaunch came off as a whole lot of personality and not a lot of process. Contrary to his taunt animation, he was never a staple champion in anyone's pool before or now, so I guess everyone was either indifferent to him or didn't like him that much. That being said, his rework by all accounts was a monumental improvement over the original, yet somehow that managed to achieve, well, nothing in terms of his play rate. He's as popular now as he was back then, which is not very popular at all. Which brings me to this video. For today, we'll be discussing Taric's rework, a retrospective. Back in the day, Taric was a champion with an archetypal yet unique niche. He was a Paladin type character. For the uninitiated, the Paladin trope entails a class or character with similar characteristics to your Garden Variety Warrior class. They're bulky and can take a lot of hits while dealing a lot of hits. The twist is that unlike warriors or berserkers who primarily emphasize physical DPS, paladins incorporate a bit of magic and/or supportive aspects to the kit, splitting their power budget among equal parts damage and healing. Taric was initially like this, a tanky bruiser who sacrificed a bit of DPS for team support. Although unlike the traditional paladin, who was more of a 70-30 if not 60-40 split between damage and support, Taric was almost 50-50, a trait that would damage his usability and reputation more often than help it. Before going through his old kit, we should first answer this. Why was Taric the only member of the Paladin archetype despite League being known for multiple champions belonging to the same class? There are many possible answers to this, but I think it's because even though the game is in totality a 5v5 team game, it's not a 5v5 team game all the way through from start to finish. As you know, the first 15 to 20 minutes more or less mandates every champion to survive on their own with only sparse interactions between teammates, with the exception of AD carry and support of course. Also, even throughout the mid to late game, teams are expected to spread out and briefly complete individual tasks, such as pushing a lane, acquiring vision control, etc. Rarely do you ever find a scenario where the entire team is moving throughout Summoner's Rift as a unit, as not only is that inefficient, but it can be disadvantageous on a macro scale. As such, every champion who isn't a support is primarily designed with the mindset that they have to be able to survive on their own. How this affected Taric in the past, and still affects him now, is tied to the 50-50 split between damage and support. As we go through his abilities, the strength of their effects increases dramatically if he's with this team, but that also means they're not very effective when used while alone, or at the very least, not as good as they can be, making it difficult to balance him to still be self-sufficient in lane while having supportive capabilities. In other words, he was split between two mutually exclusive functions and could not operate at full capacity in either lest he become overpowered, especially considering he was a stat checker. Taric's passive Gemcraft went through 3 iterations, but the only version worth covering is the latest one before it got reworked. Gemcraft behaved as a spellblade of sorts. After using an ability, his next attack would deal bonus damage based on his armor and reduce the cooldowns of all his abilities by 2 seconds. Obviously, the idea was to use your abilities one by one and auto-attack in between to deal bonus damage while refreshing their cooldowns, which were quite long otherwise. Moving on to his Q, Imbue was an activated cast that healed him and the nearest ally champion for a pretty serious amount, but if alone or used Q solely on himself, it became 40% stronger. Despite its very simple premise, Imbue was arguably his most problematic ability. Neutral sustain without a significant cost or need to interact raises a ton of potential issues. If Taric had blue buff provided you had enough time, he would be able to regenerate his entire team back to full HP with a few casts of Q. For reference, the reason Kale's W Celestial Blessing has abysmally low base numbers and scaling is because of that. They don't want to and shouldn't give champions free sustain like that. Mordekaiser's W forces them to deal or take damage to build up his shield. Soraka pays an HP cost to use Astral Infusion. That was the whole problem with Yuumi prior to her rework. A few zoomies and she can full heal anyone. Taric's Imbue did have a long cooldown, but so long as he was attacking something he could reduce that very fast. And unlike Sona or Kale, his Q healed a ton thanks to a high flat amount and the fact that it scaled off his bonus health. So building tank would still augment his recovery. This is also where we encounter a running dilemma with his old kit. Imbue is capable of healing 2 people per cast, himself and someone else. If done in this way, the total is 440 base plus 60% AP plus 10% bonus health. Whereas if used on just him, it's only 308 base plus 7% bonus health, noticeably weaker mileage. Bear this in mind as we go through the rest of his kit. His W was Shatter, with the passive and inactive. The passive was an aura effect, giving Taric bonus armor while Shatter's off cooldown on top of extra armor to himself and nearby friendlies based on a portion of his total armor. You can think of it almost like Malphite's Granite Shield W interaction that's weaker on him but can be distributed to his cohorts. This can be a big deal, especially in the late game. Assuming the average Taric back in the day had, say, 250 armor in the mid game, he's giving 30 armor to everyone within 1100 units, very wide coverage. 120 armor equates to 2400 gold in value, and against a heavy AD team, that mattered a lot. The active component was also interesting as it dealt AoE damage while reducing the armor of all targets hit by a flat amount, plus a portion of his total armor, giving his team effectively that much in armor penetration. Naturally, the more targets affected by his W, friend, and foe, the more mileage he got out of it, which meant it was at its weakest when affecting only himself and one enemy champion. Dazzle was really his only consistent ability, and it was a pretty stupid good one at that. Like Sion's Cryptic Gaze, it was a ranged point-and-click stun whose damage was based on how close he is to his target, but the stun duration remained the same no matter what. Ranged point-and-click stun that lasts for more than a second and a half, nothing else needs to be said. Pretty solid ability. His ultimate Radiance went through 2 iterations, and both were crazy. The first iteration was a toggle ability that would continuously regenerate his HP at the cost of mana per second, and while active, he would gain bonus AD and give a fraction of that bonus to nearby friendlies and minions, which is interesting. Just like Sion, the AD bonus is a bit misplaced. Taric has no abilities that scale off attack damage, which meant the only value of this ultimate was the buff he gave to his teammates, but assuming it tagged all 4 members of his team, that would total 180 attack damage at rank 3, equating to 6300 gold in stats. 6300. Taric's W and first ultimate could issue more than 10,000 gold in extra stats in the late game. Name one other champion who could do that. Oh wait. Nah, just kidding, we have to move on. The second iteration was not too different from the first. Instead of healing, it was a damaging ability that left an aura effect for 10 seconds after, giving Taric bonus attack damage and ability power with half of each shared to every friendly. The bonus AP made more sense as it's synergized with Imbue and Dazzle. Now, as for the stat distribution, obviously it was cut down and spread across 2 stats, and only a marginal number of champions were hyperscalers, but even so, 35 AD and AP is equal to just shy of 2000 gold in value, so Taric still had the potential to give over 10,000 gold in stats towards the late game. True to his position as a Paladin, he was all about buffing and supporting his team while dealing his fair share of damage. Historically, Taric was famous for being an alternative to the anti-AD champion Malphite. Thanks to Gemcraft, Shatter, and Dazzle, he had a very potent trade combo, and Imbue allowed him to recover most if not all damage dealt by his opponent. This made him very effective against top laners who relied on short burst trades but didn't have any form of lingering sustain. For example, Riven, Jax, Old Pantheon, Old Wukong, that kind of stuff. And remember, there was no version of Divine Sunderer back then, so items that gave sustain were few and far between. And then towards the mid to late game, he would effectively double as a second support, locking down someone with Dazzle, and then using Imbue, Shatter, and Radiance to juice his team back up and break down the enemy team. Credit where credit was due. Taric did have a purpose. It was a niche and frankly stat-checky purpose, but compared to some of the older, more badly designed champs like Nunu, Sion, what have you, he possessed a clear win condition that fell in line with the overall goal of his team. He could play as a conventional champion, progress in a conventional way, and then win the game in a conventional fashion. However, there was one critical issue preventing him from finding stable representation. Despite having a consistent game plan, that game plan had inconsistent results. If we go back through his abilities, 3 out of 5 of them have fluctuating strength based on if he was near a bunch of teammates and/or enemies or isolated. The way they balanced him was towards the midpoint. Taric was considered a full champion if Shatter and Radiance affected at least 2 other people besides him. The 40% stronger heal on Imbue if targeting himself was enough to serve as that equilibrium point, but in essence, Taric was obligated to stick to his team as often as possible, preventing him from delivering a lot of what the solo lanes expect out of his champions and kinda disqualifying him from being a jungler to a degree. You might be thinking, why didn't he just become a support? Easy answer. Taric was neither an enchanter nor tank support. When it came to being an enchanter, he's a melee champion. Enchanters are almost exclusively ranged for a good reason. They can't afford to face tank a lot of damage. Now you could argue all of Taric's relevant support abilities are ranged, like Imbue, Dazzle, Shatter's Aura, and Radiance, but there's another issue. Unlike other enchanters who can get by on very little, Taric was heavily dependent on gold. He couldn't coast by on support items alone. As for why he couldn't function as a tank support, it's cause the only engage ability he had was Dazzle. Why would you want a tank support with only 100 CC when you can pick Nautilus, Thresh, Leona, Blitzcrank, or Alistar who have way more? Taric was stuck in a weird limbo state where buffing him to be 100% functional with his team and 100% functional while alone would cause one or the other to be far too oppressive, forcing him to always remain at like 75% capacity for each one and place the onus on the player to somehow combine those 275 into a 150, even though realistically that was not feasible. The concept behind his design was a good one, it just wasn't pragmatically executable in League's environment. Paladins work in MMOs because the squad is always together and always working in tandem with each other, whereas in a MOBA, champions are first and foremost meant to exist independently with any team synergy being coincidental, such as Yasuo and Malphite. They made it so Yasuo's ultimate would be conveniently more accessible if he was on a team with knockups, but still gave him his own way to set up knockups out of consideration for the fact that he won't always be on that kind of team. Old Taric never had this luxury. The goal of his visual gameplay update was to veer him more in the direction of a dedicated support by shifting that 50-50 into a 30-70, a decision that would culminate in the first attempt at a hybrid between Enchanter and Tank. And results were mixed. His entire kit, with the exception of his ultimate, kept the same premise as their previous versions overall though. Bravado is more or less exactly the same as Gemcraft, except it's split off into 2 attacks instead of 1. Starlight's Touch went through several renditions over the years, but the current version is that it stores charges over time that increase the strength of the active heal per stack. At the expense of being more convoluted to use, Starlight's Touch can heal everyone on his team instead of just him and one other person. At full power, it's a pretty substantial heal. The cooldown reset interaction from Bravado led to a lot of funny moments, one of which was famously performed by Light Rocket on Tylo1's stream.
God, I've reset. Oh, thanks, bro. Hey! Hey! Let's go! Let's go! We back, bitch!
Bastion, on the other hand, went in the opposite direction. Now instead of being able to increase everyone's armor, he can only boost himself and one other person, but in doing so, he shields them for a small amount, and his Q, E, and ultimate are echoed by his companion as well, indirectly increasing his cast range by a very considerable amount. Speaking of his E, Dazzle now became an AoE attack, so now it can potentially stun all 5 members of the enemy team if used. The caveat is that it's no longer a point-and-click ability, but I think overall that was a net positive, especially since he can use it on his partner to give them a free stun. Cosmic Radiance may very well be the single greatest ultimate in the game, or the single most useless ultimate in the game. After a 2.5 second delay, he can render his entire team invulnerable for 2.5 seconds. The implications of this are limitless. If used at the right time and place, Taric's ultimate can win teamfights by itself. So rather than giving his team free stats by existing, they wanted to make him a skill-expressive support by placing heavy emphasis on targeting, positioning, and timing. And in that regard, they more than succeeded. At full capacity, Taric's supportive capabilities far exceed any enchanter or tank support in the game, and in terms of gameplay, they did a reasonably good job at shifting him towards that 30-70 split of damage and support. The problem is, they never really addressed the root problem of old Taric. They actually made it worse. Taric's issue wasn't that he didn't do enough, it's that he was divided between having to perform well on his own and performing well with his team. But they were both working against each other, making it difficult for him to find lasting employment in either field. While they did manage to bring Taric more towards a support playstyle, he's still not a true dedicated support. Dazzle can now stun multiple targets, but he still lacks a traditional engage tool like Nautilus Q, Leona E, Alistar W, etc. Before you say he's an excellent follow-up engager by giving his teammate Dazzle, we're talking about as a support in bot lane. Unless your name is Mila or Samira, it's not in the AD carry's best interest to go headfirst into the enemy bot laner, so he would have to walk up and face tank a lot of damage or pray for a jungler who can engage on their behalf, not the most reliable game plan out there. The need to spam Bravado to generate stacks of Starlight's Touch made him far less effective at healing than his prior version, arguably making him a worse healer than before. And though I understand the intent behind Cosmic Radiance, I actually think it's worse than the old Radiance. While it's true it has the potential to influence a fight in a way no other could possibly dream of, it's so powerful of an ability that the insanely long activation requirement for it almost negates the positive effects. It's like Exodia from Yu-Gi-Oh! By having all 5 pieces of it in your hand, you win the game instantly, but the difficulty in getting the 5 cards in your hand consistently is too great that it loses all practicality to it. Fights in League are usually burst heavy, and in the 2.5 seconds it takes for the ultimate to complete, the person or people he's trying to save might already be dead. Moreover, the fact that Starlight's Touch, Dazzle, and Cosmic Radiance all have very narrow hitboxes as opposed to before where they were auras with a wide radius or point and click makes him ironically more inconsistent than his previous abilities. Lastly, the only way he can assure the value of his abilities is through Bastion, guaranteeing at least one person will always get the benefits of Starlight's Touch, Dazzle, and Cosmic Radiance. In that scenario, it makes more practical sense for him to partner up with a melee hypercarry like his jungler than a squishy marksman, as he can get more mileage that way. A notion that you've no doubt remembered materialized into the infamous Taric Mastery Gold Funnel strategy. In the end, I think they tried to make Taric do too much, which was exactly the opposite of what they were supposed to do, make him more focused on one side or the other. They kind of did that, but the way they did it made him more inconsistent than before. Old Taric was very consistent in terms of his abilities, it's just the scenarios where he could make full use of them weren't consistent. New Taric is very consistent in terms of scenarios, but his abilities became extremely consistent, creating a new problem by trying to fix another. It's a very strange rework. They basically made the most amazing pizza you'll ever taste in your entire life in a sushi restaurant. A+ for effort and execution, but you kind of miss the point of where you are and what you need. At least that's how I see it. But maybe you guys disagree. If you do, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. That's gonna be it for today though, so if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @VarsVaram, join my Discord server, and check out my other retrospectives if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.